I remember when I discovered America. It happened around 8 p.m. on November 4th, 1980, the night Ronald Reagan was elected president. I was on my knees, crying, sending desperate pleas to my Lord and Savior, Jesus, when I was interrupted by my grandmother summoning me. Perhaps she had discovered my sister's candy stash. Maybe she needed me to fix the vertical hold on the floor model television. Or, as any child who grew up in a black home could tell you, maybe she just needed a cold glass of water. When she saw the tears streaming down my face, she asked what was wrong. I confessed to one of the cardinal sins of my household. I was listening to grown folks talking. I told her that I couldn't understand how she was so calm when our worst fears had been realized. I knew that we were going to have to hightail it to Canada now, and told her she should join me in prayer as I asked Jesus to protect and guide us as we drove to our new home across the border. Between sobs, I asked if we were waiting for daybreak to leave. An evening getaway seemed safer to me, even though my mom had terrible night vision. From the look on her face, it was clear that she had no idea what I was talking about. I spilled the beans about how I overheard her tell my mother a few weeks ago, if Reagan is elected, he'll send black people back in the cotton fields. That sent my young mind spinning. I didn't know how to pick cotton. Would I have to give up my dream of playing point guard for the Los Angeles Lakers and my future side hustle as a tambourine player in Earth, Wind & Fire to get a cotton picking degree in picking cotton? Plus, I could read. And you know what happens to slaves who could read? I told her not to worry about me, though. I had already packed a bag with my favorite underoos, some corduroy pants, and a few sweatshirts. According to the 1979 edition of the World Book Encyclopedia, Canadian winters could be quite brutal. After my grandmother and mother finished explaining sarcasm between guffaws, I felt relieved, albeit a little embarrassed. I still wasn't quite sure if they were trying to make me feel better about our impending enslavement, but I took their word that I didn't have to learn the secret language embedded in Negro spirituals. Just in case, I gave them a hand-drawn map of what I thought was the best escape route. If all else failed, we could simply follow the drinking gourd, which, of course, was the code name for the Big Dipper. I volunteered to show them how to find the Big Dipper in the night sky because you never knew if the fugitive slave catchers had an APB out on your canary yellow station wagon. While they had no interest in learning about underground railroad-based astronomy, my grandmother did have one question. "Mikey, where did you learn all this stuff from, boy?" she asked. Now I was confused. I couldn't tell if she was impressed or perturbed. She had always told me that there are no stupid questions, but she was coming dangerously close to proving her adage wrong. "Where do you think I learned it?" I replied. "The middle room." In 1952, James and Marvell Harriot built a house for their 8 children in Hartsville, South Carolina, a scant 22 miles from the forced labor camp where James S. Bradley enslaved 253 human beings, including Marvell's great-great-grandfather, Irvin. The Harriot house had 4 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a dining room, and a living room you could enter only if you were entertaining company, had obtained written and verbal permission, or if somebody who had the Holy Ghost died. But the best room was in the center of the house, a den-style family room that would eventually become known as the middle room. 5 generations of the Harriot family would play, pray, laugh, sing, dance, and learn about the world from the middle room's vantage point. Long before I was born, my grandfather lined the entire middle room with sturdy oak shelves, and over the years, to this very day, everyone in the Harriot clan has deposited their books there. It rivals almost any independent bookstore and some libraries, with stacks and stacks of books on topics from science fiction to history. It also contained a state-of-the-art television set, turntable, and hi-fi 8-track tape player that mostly played James Cleveland albums, episodes of Trapper John M.D., and election results. The burnt umber carpet was where I learned how to play Uno, spades, and acey-deucey, the remedial version of backgammon. The middle room was also a stage for family talent shows, a courtroom, and, most importantly, the homeroom, study hall, and resource center for all 4 pupils enrolled in the Dorothy Harriot Elementary School for Dorothy Harriot's children. When I was a child, my mother chose to homeschool my sisters and me. As an adult, she informed me that my early homeschooled education was an experiment due to her belief that a black child cannot fully realize their humanity in the presence of whiteness. Although she drilled us on mathematics, grammar, and the Bible, our schooling was primarily self-directed courtesy of the middle room. I read anything and everything, which led to many awkward incidents, like the strange side-eye I received at church after I read the autobiography of Malcolm X at 9 years old and began ending every sentence with, "If it is Allah's will." When I was 12, after reading the science fiction novel The Soul of the Robot, I stumbled across W.E.B. Du Bois' The Souls of Black Folk. That couldn't be much different, right? I was scarcely 2 pages in when I read this. After the Egyptian and Indian, the Greek and Roman, the Teuton and Mongolian, the Negro is a sort of 7th son born with a veil and gifted with the second sight in this American world. A world which yields him no self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, 2 souls, 2 thoughts, 2 unreconciled strivings, 2 warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. In this merging, he wishes neither of the older selves to be lost. Reading this, my brain fired off a dozen questions. Where was this alternative universe that had reduced blackness to an afterthought? And through whose eyes did Du Bois see himself? I would later discover the miseducation of the Negro, in which Carter G. Woodson explains that in the American education system, the entirety of black people's existence is studied only as a problem or dismissed as of little consequence. Du Bois eloquently echoed the sentiment, asking, "Between me and the other world there is ever an unasked question. Unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, by others through the difficulty of rightly framing it. All, nevertheless, flutter around it. How does it feel to be a problem?" I eventually realized that my middle room education was the inverse of Woodson's miseducated Negro. My mother had reverse engineered a curriculum founded on the words and works of great thinkers like Dorothy B. Porter, Arturo Schomburg, Zora Neale Hurston, and John Edward Bruce, all of whom, in one way or another, are manifestations of Du Bois' mission to manufacture a new measuring tape. I am but a bastard child born with the privilege of wandering into an already constructed house that Du Bois built. The history I discovered in the middle room wasn't just an alternative version of American history, it was the story of an entirely different place, wholly incompatible with the whitewashed mythology enshrined in our collective memory. I have never known that place because that America, in reality, does not exist. That story of America is a fantastical, overwrought, and fictive tale. It is a fantasy where Christopher Columbus discovered a land that he never set foot in. It is the story of the pilgrims on the Mayflower building a new nation. It is George Washington's cherry tree and Abraham Lincoln's log cabin. It is the story of slaves who spontaneously teleported themselves here with nothing but strong backs and a brain full of Negro spirituals. It is Betsy Ross's sewing kit and Paul Revere's horse and Thomas Jefferson's pen and Benjamin Franklin's eyeglasses and George Washington's teeth and liberty and justice for all. And it is a history predicated on lies. History can never be objective or unbiased because no matter how hard the storytellers may try, the perception of reality prejudices all stories. The academic field of history is dominated by white men handicapped by the inability to see whiteness's impact on America's biography. The best historians try to approximate the truth by unbending the collection of funhouse mirrors through which the past has been viewed, but it isn't simply a counterfeit version of history. It is a fable that erases the reflection of an entire people to ensure that the mythology of the heroes live happily ever after. Because of the middle room, I was not burdened with unbending the funhouse mirror of America's past. For me, the writings of Du Bois, Woodson, and the other black chroniclers of yesteryear were not counter-narratives to a blanched, whitewashed version of a somewhat true story. For me, the America that existed in the middle room is the real America. In my education, we are the sun, and everything in the history of this nation's existence is simply rotating around the blackness illuminating our universe. When we are dead and all the things that ever were have turned to dust, we will not be history. We will be things that once were. A few of us, however, will have lived a life so notable that a white man might deem it worthy of bending his opposable thumb to register our existence into posterity. The best we can hope for is to become a part of white history, because American history is white history. Except for this one. This history is black AF. History unwhitened. Something was wrong with me. I was always in a daze. I couldn't sit still. Long before I was eventually diagnosed with the most acute form of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, I was just hyper. Although we now understand that ADHD is a common mental neurodevelopment issue that affects millions of children, I was diagnosed as bad. My mother tried to combat my hyperactivity with diet, forbidding my sisters and me from eating anything that contained red dye number 5 or sugar, except on Fridays when I could choose between a roll of Lifesavers or a pack of Chiclets. In 5th grade, I spent months in the Harriot household's version of juvenile house arrest when I was caught tracing my mother's name on an interim report that described me as smart but have trouble following directions. The third deacon in command at church nicknamed me the absent-minded professor. And then there were the coats. Coats were the bane of my childhood existence. I always left them. I left them on church pews, in cars, and especially at school. And because coats are the most expensive part of a kid's wardrobe, I have received more dressing downs from my mom about coats than anything except my propensity to forget to pull the garbage can to the curb on trash day. If there is a heaven for jackets, it is almost certainly filled with the misplaced winter wear purchased by Dorothy Harriot. I always lost my coat. So, in 5th grade, when I begged my mother to buy me a goose down, a feather-filled ski jacket with removable sleeves that had become the latest fashion, of course she gave me a lecture about how I'd have to suffer frostbite and hypothermia for the next 2 winters if I lost that puffy coat. The day my mother bought that goose down from the Army-Navy store was the second happiest day of my sartorial life, exceeded only by the parachute pants and Ghostbusters tee I received for my birthday a few years later. One day, I was walking home from elementary school, which required me to walk past the hangout spot where all the thugs cut school to smoke cigarettes and look at naked magazines. I was in one of my trademark dazes when the scent of menthol-laced smoke alerted me to the fact that I was being followed. By the time I tried to run, it was too late. This crew surrounded me and demanded I give up the goose down. I thought of my mother's wrath. I thought of all the long-lost jackets from the past, from the bootleg members only to the Sears tough skin with corduroy sleeves. I thought of my mother's frostbite warning and the days in middle room solitary confinement in my future. I refused. They beat it off me. I struggled so hard that while they got the body of the jacket, they couldn't get the sleeves. But what good are warm arms when you're walking home with the rest of your body fighting off cold? Of course, I kept it a secret. I wasn't embarrassed about the mugging as much as I was afraid of my mother's wrath when she realized that I no longer had the item on which she had spent an entire $56. I knew she wouldn't buy the mugging story. I had to get it back before she found out. So instead of telling her that I had been robbed, I told my 2 older cousins, Fred and Squeak, along with my best friend, James Bond. They were already in junior high. They probably knew the culprits. A few days later, as I shivered home from school, avoiding the Newport shortcut, they yelled out to me to come over. They had found it. There, wearing my sleeveless goose down, was my next-door neighbor, Freaky D. Freaky D wasn't big, but he was fearless. At 13, he was already smoking marijuana and drinking Colt 45. Apparently, he had been casing my goose down for months. Surrounded by my investigative squad, Freaky D swore that he had owned the coat for over a year. His friends, whom I recognized as the muggers, backed him up. They corroborated his story, insisting that he had the coat for over a year. After a few minutes of interrogation, Double O, Fred, and Squeak bought his story and let him go. As they walked away, Freaky D let me know it wasn't over. "I'ma remember this, Mikey," he yelled. "Freaky D don't steal." The next morning, I was called into the principal's office. Sitting there was my mother, along with Freaky D and the vice principal of the Hartsville Junior High School. With tears in his eyes, Freaky D recounted how I had masterminded the plot to convince my friends to steal his jacket. As illogical and preposterous as it sounded to me, to the jury in the principal's office, Freaky D's testimony was perfectly plausible. I vehemently objected to Freaky D's lie, explaining that there was no evidence for this wholly untrue story. He was the real jacket thief. Unbeknownst to me, Freaky D had proof, which was why my mother was summoned to the school. Staring a hole into my soul, she reached into my book bag and pulled out the evidence that confirmed the true history of the goose down jacket, the sleeves of which matched perfectly. What you are about to read is a true story. The names have not been changed to protect the guilty. In most history books, America is colonized by European settlers. In chronicling this nation's past, historians recognize that the English, Dutch, Spanish, and French colonists are human beings with different backstories, cultures, and motivations. We know the political incentives, economic concerns, and social mores that explain away the theft, violence, and genocide they committed against the savage silhouettes that we are too unbothered to name. The people and cultures whose blood watered the stolen landscapes are usually dehumanized by simply remaining anonymous. The stolen Africans are not Akan or Nyawezi, they are just slaves. The various indigenous nations who were extinguished are never Oseti, Sakoan, or even Iroquois. They are just Indians, or at most Native Americans. Yet, somehow, the states and colonies that replace them have borders, legislatures, and distinguishable features. Black AF history does not upset this timeless tradition of American scholarship. It uses the same scholarly conventions to which we have become accustomed. To make sure the reader isn't disoriented by a new historical standard, this book recognizes that the English, Dutch, Spanish, and French land thieves are just white people. While it may sometimes seem abrasive, confrontational, and even dismissive, this book recognizes that the only difference between a burglar and a settler is who writes the police reports. In fact, the only difference between the Black AF version of history and the way America's story is customarily recounted is that whiteness is not the center of the universe around which everything else revolves. While this book does not seek to defy whiteness, it also does not obfuscate the flaws of black heroes. In this history, Martin Luther King Jr. is a human being who is sometimes afraid. Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois are rivals, but their ultimate goal is the same: to get free. In this book, enslaved Africans are not victims. They are warriors from the Ashanti Kingdom and the founding fathers of the Gola culture and the creators of America's first democracy. And while this book is not the complete history of black people in America, it acknowledges that too much has been stolen for that to ever exist. In this book, there is no America. In this book, the country we know as the United States is just a parcel of land that was stolen and repurposed as a settler state using European logic and the laws of white supremacy. This book is a story about a strong-arm robbery. It is about family and friends trying to recover what was stolen. It is the testimony and the verdict that a jury of our peers has never heard. I can do that in my history. Freaky D taught me that. Years later, I asked Freaky D about that jacket. He acknowledged that he knew it was stolen when he bought it from the thieves. According to Freaky D, the guys strung him along about the sleeves for days, promising that they would eventually be delivered. He claims he didn't know the coat was mine until Fred, Double O, and Squeak confronted him about it, which is when he came up with the plan to get the sleeves. And because all history is infused with the historian's values, in Freaky D's version of history, receiving stolen property doesn't make him a thief. Like Freaky D, America don't steal. This is the Black AF history of America. This book is the sleeves.